Hey everyone, it's Samantha Hildebrandt here. Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about counting carbs and figuring out your insulin to carb ratio. If you are a new diabetic and the doctor told you that you now have to start counting carbs, well, that may be a bit of a shock, especially if you've never once counted a carb in your entire life before. Counting carbs can get annoying, confusing, and it's just a life change when you have to start counting carbs. So I want to dive into why we have to count carbs, how we can better count carbs, and how you can figure out your insulin to carb ratio. I remember when I was first diagnosed, the doctor in the hospital told me that I had to start counting carbs. And I remember thinking, dude, I don't even know what a carb is. So how am I supposed to count the carbs if I don't even know what a carb is? I mean, I always just thought a carb was pasta. I really never knew much past that. And so counting carbs was a foreign thing to me. I have never counted a carb in my life before being diagnosed. And so, yeah, it can get a little frustrating having to start counting carbs and even figuring out what food is a carb. You know, is sugar a carb? Like what is happening right now with the carb situation? And so it can get really complicated. However, the good news is it's easy to learn. It does take time, but it is easy to learn. And so don't stress. Counting carbs can be easy, especially when you do figure out your insulin to carb ratio. If you're a type 1 diabetic and you take insulin, that can also help the situation. So let's get into first, what is a carb? I'm not going to dive into the super scientific side of a carb because nobody really needs to know that. However, you do need to know when to spot a carb. And really what carbs do for the body, it's a macronutrient that gives the body energy. So carbs are not a bad thing. We definitely need carbs because it gives us energy. It gives our body energy to, go throughout the day, to do things throughout the day. If we didn't have carbs ever, like zero carbs, we would be very tired and we'd have to get that energy source from something else. So yes, we absolutely need carbs. However, I would say personally, we don't need a ton of carbs to have energy, okay? So a little bit of carbs will do us great and it will help us provide energy for tomorrow and the remainder of the week. And so yes, you should absolutely be eating carbs, but there's a balance here, especially when you become a type 1 diabetic or a type 2 diabetic. You do have to balance out that carb ratio for your body. And so how can you spot a carb? Well, of course, like we all know the typical carbs like bread, pasta, but to be honest, carbs are in most foods. Most food that you eat has some type of carb, which can sound scary if you're a new diabetic because you're like, oh my gosh, now I have to start counting carbs for every single food. There's some flexibility here, but yes, most foods do have carbs. And then how do you start counting carbs? Oh my gosh. So you look at a piece of bread and you're like, how do I have a clue how many carbs are in this piece of bread? Well, the good news is if it is a packaged food, so it comes in a bag or a box or something along those lines, on the back there is a nutritional label that will have the carb count for the serving size. So one thing you want to make sure when you're looking at a label is that you look at the serving size, because on the back of the label, the carb will say, I don't know, this is an example, 10 carbs for the serving size, right? But then you're like, oh, there's only 10 carbs in this entire box. No, if there's a serving of 5 servings in that box, then you have to multiply it. So for 5 servings, if there's 10 carbs, that would be 50 carbs total if you were to eat the entire box. And so you have to take that into account when you're eating your food and making sure that you eat the serving size. A lot of times on the nutritional labels, it is confusing because it will say like 1 ounce is the serving size. And you're like, what is 1 ounce, right? And then you have to like figure that out. You can buy a kitchen scale to help you determine, how many ounces are in your food. To be honest, I did buy one when I was first diagnosed, and I think I've maybe used it once. So I've been diagnosed with type 1 for 4 years, and I've used my scale one time. So I don't use it a ton. It can be a very beneficial tool if you want to measure out your carbs, especially if you're a new diabetic. I think it can be very beneficial. However, it's definitely not necessary. As you progress through this diabetes journey, you will start to be able to look at food and just kind of estimate how many carbs are in it. But that can be really scary in the beginning because you don't know, right? You've never experienced this before, and you just have to figure it out on your own. And you have to, really just do some trial and error. Another way though to figure out, okay, how many carbs is in an apple, right? Because an apple doesn't come with a nutritional label. So you're like, I have no idea how many carbs are in an apple. Well, here's the thing. Google is your best friend, okay? So you can simply do a Google search and say, how many carbs are in an apple? And it will probably pop up and say, a medium apple has 20 carbs. Now, this can also get confusing because then you have to determine, is your apple a medium apple, right? And so, there's some fluctuation there, but you'll kind of be able to tell like, oh no, I think this might be a smaller apple, might be a larger apple, and kind of estimate from there how many carbs are in that apple. Now, there are a lot of cool things that you can do to lower that carb count, and I don't want to dive into a lot of that today because it can get very confusing, but I want to give you an example really quick. If you were to pair some type of fat with the carb, that will help lower the carb amount. It's called net carbs. I'm not going to dive into this, but one thing that a diabetic can do to kind of lower that carb count, if they're like, I really want an apple, but I don't want my blood sugar to spike, what can I do? Well, what you can actually do to lower the blood sugar spike is pair it with fat. And then you're like, okay, Samantha, what food has fat in it? Once again, this is something you'll learn over time, okay? So if right now you're like, oh my God, I have no idea what food has fat in it, that's totally normal. I had no idea either, but you start to learn. Peanut butter. Peanut butter has a lot of protein and fat in it, and so it is a great source to pair with an apple. Now, once again, you have to look at the peanut butter and make sure there's not any added sugar. Peanut butter does come with a label, which is great, so you can look at the back and say, okay, how many carbs are in this peanut butter? How much protein? How much fat? Is there any added sugar? I would avoid peanut butter with added sugar. It's just unnecessary. Peanut butter is great as it is. You don't need to add sugar to peanut butter. So just go to the store, try to find one that doesn't have added sugar, and then pair that with your apple, and that will lessen the blood sugar spike. But anyway, I digress. I don't want to dive too much into the pairings just yet, but I wanted to talk about how to figure out how many carbs are in certain foods. And really, like I mentioned, Google is going to be your best friend. There are some apps that you can download on your phone where you can do quick searches on estimated carb counts, but I personally will just Google it if I don't know. I'm like, how many carbs are in this banana? Like, I don't know. You can just Google it. Or if it's a packaged food, just look at the label on the back and make sure to compare it to the serving size, and make sure to multiply it if you're eating more than the one serving size that it's recommending. Now, I've had type 1 diabetes for over 4 years, and honestly, that's not that long of a time. I know people who have had it 10, 15, 20 years. And so it's funny because they look at me like 4 years, you're still a newbie, but I feel like I'm an OG type 1 diabetic here. And so I'm not. I was diagnosed at age 29, so I wouldn't say I'm an OG, but I do feel like I have a pretty good idea of, if I just have a bowl of food, I can estimate roughly how many carbs are in my meal. And to be honest, I actually don't count carbs very, very closely. Like, I don't say, okay, there's a handful of rice right there that's 35 carbs, and then my chicken has 10 carbs, and then my corn has 10 carbs. Like, I don't do that really. I kind of just look at it and then estimate in my head how much insulin I need to take. And once again, that is something that will come with time, so don't stress about that. I think carb counting in the beginning of a new diagnosis is really, really helpful. And so if you can do that, that's great. Write down on a piece of paper if it helps you, like what your meal is, how many carbs, how many total carbs that will be. And then, of course, it comes down to figuring out your insulin to carb ratio, which can be very tough in the beginning because Once again, it takes a lot of trial and error. You have no idea unless you just try things out. So don't be afraid to try to figure out what your insulin to carb ratio is by making mistakes, because that's just how you figure it out. And so, your endocrinologist can probably give you an idea of something to start with. Mine has fluctuated over time. For example, right now I'm about 1 to 10, so I take 1 unit of insulin for every 10 carbs, roughly, right? There's some things that go into that make it a little bit more complicated. But if I was solely looking at a plate and had to count my carbs, I would do that. So if I'm looking at a plate, like I just mentioned, with the rice, 35 carbs, corn, 10, meat, 10, that's 55 carbs, right? That would be a 55 carb plate. And then I have to take insulin. So my insulin ratio is 1 to 10. Now, obviously 55 is an awkward number there, because that means I would have to take at least 5 units of insulin, or I could take 6 units of insulin. So it's kind of hard in this situation because, for me, I'm on MDI, and so I don't have a lot of flexibility with units, and so I do have to take a whole unit. So if you're on a pump, it's a little nicer because you can literally put in the exact insulin amount that you want, which is really nice. Another benefit of a pump right there. But for me, I would probably take lower because I don't want to go low. And so in this situation, I would probably take 5 units of insulin. And then if I notice that my blood sugar is going up, in a couple hours, I'll just take more insulin at that time. And so figuring out your insulin to carb ratio, it takes time. You have to make mistakes, and you have to just kind of guess and then watch your blood sugar using your blood sugar monitor or your meter or however you're measuring your blood sugar. Follow along that way and make sure to write this stuff down, because if you don't write it down, you're not going to remember, and then you can never make changes going forward. So especially if you're a new diabetic, I recommend having a journal to write all this diabetes stuff down. You will, once again, I said, let's say tomorrow you have the same bowl. Well, guess what? Now you can be like, okay, I know what I did yesterday. How can I do something differently to get a better blood sugar number today? And then that will keep going and happening, and so on and so forth. The other thing, though, I don't want to scare you if you're a new diabetic, but your insulin to carb ratio might change a lot. Certain times of the month, if you're a female, your insulin to carb ratio might change. There's certain things going on in your life. If you're stressed, your insulin to carb ratio might change. So a lot of things can go into effect with your diabetes, which is fun. It's fun stuff, but it's okay, because overall, it's nice to have kind of a basis for your insulin to carb ratio. But once again, down the road, you might be able to just look at a plate and not really count the carbs, but just be like, I think I'm going to take 5 units of insulin for this, just by looking at it. You don't have to go through the actual carb counting, and that's kind of where I'm at in my stage of life. But don't get me wrong, I still make mistakes all the time where, even last night I actually took too much insulin for my meal, and then I started to go low and I had to eat sugar. And so, it's a whole thing. It's just what it's like to be a type 1 diabetic. But the good news is that you can figure it out. You will know what a carb is. You will have an insulin to carb ratio. You will make mistakes, but overall, you'll do great, and you won't stress so much every day, and you'll be able to eat foods that you want to eat and then not have to stress about it so much. So I hope that makes sense. There are a lot of books out there that can help you determine these things, but I really think it comes down to just trial and error. You got to eat something, you got to look at your blood sugar, see what happens, and then try again tomorrow. Now, if you are a diabetic, a type 2 diabetic, and you don't take insulin, this can get a little bit more difficult. I would say the pairings come in more beneficial in this scenario. So I'm not going to dive into that today, but food pairing. So like I mentioned with the apple, you're not going to want to eat an apple by itself. You're going to want to pair it with the peanut butter. That will help with that blood sugar spike. Type 1s definitely should be doing this too, but the only benefit is we have insulin. And so we can eat more carby foods probably than a type 2 should do that's not on insulin. So anyway, I hope this helps. I hope you understand a little bit more about what a carb is, and hopefully it will help you going forward when you are trying a new food. All right, guys, thanks so much. I'll see you next week. Bye. Have you recently gotten an A1C test and the results were higher than you'd like? Well, if so, check out my ebook below. It will help you lower your A1C, have a blood sugar that is in range more often, and really just help your health overall. So check it out below. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to message me on Instagram at type1.tribe, and I will see you next week. Bye.